Everybody online. On behalf of the Northwest Territories Council on Invasive Species, Pests, and Pathogens, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for the fourth in our series of webinars to celebrate National Invasive Species Action Week. Today, we are excited to have a talk by Bruce Bennett on alien and invasive plants in the NWT. So to introduce Bruce Bennett has been a plant taxonomist for over 37 years. He moved to Yukon Territory in 1995. His botanical work and interests have taken him throughout Yukon, Northwest Territories, Alaska, Nunavut, and British Columbia, and the Arctic areas of Manitoba and Newfoundland. Since 2012, he has coordinated the Yukon's Conservation Data Center with Environment Yukon. He is the co-chair of the Vascular Plant Specialist Subcommittee for the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, or COSEWIC. Bruce is also the curator of Canada's only Northern Herbarium, or plant collection, known as BABY, or B-A-B-Y. What does that stand for, Bruce?
Bruce Andrew Bennett, Yukon. And when they were going to get the acronym, they asked me, they recommended YUK. Yukon Herbarium, Y-U-K-H. And I said, I didn't really like yuck, but I preferred baby, and it hadn't been taken. So,
okay,
so that
great.
made it a lot easier.
Yeah, I'll pass things over to you now, Bruce, to take us through the webinar.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Joanne, and the screen looks good.
Yeah,
so,
looks great.
I'd like to thank everybody for joining. I don't know how you want to deal with questions, whether people just raise up their hands or I don't mind being interrupted because I never know what I'm going to say until I say it. So I'm not on the script. So if something is there's a question, please feel free to moderate that.
For sure. Yeah, we've got a Q&A box, so folks can put their questions in there at any time. And if it's pertinent, I can speak up and ask it during the presentation, or we can save them till the end. We'll have a full Q&A session at the end for any questions folks have.
Great. And I realized that it was scheduled for a whole hour, but my presentation's probably only about 20, 25 minutes, something like that. So we will be able to have lots of time for questions at the end. So
perfect.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I always like to explain what the Conservation Data Center is, and I expect most people now know what the Conservation Data Center network is, but we have a Conservation Data Center or Natural Heritage Program in all the provinces, territories, and states. And you don't even have to be a province, territory, or a state. For instance, the Navajo First Nation has their own conservation data center, and the Tennessee Water Authority has their own conservation data center. So it's but what we do is we work together and we use the same software and we use the same standards. So if I say something is secure in Yukon, it means the same thing as it being secure in Florida. At least it should, because we're using the same systems and methodology. Oh, I see I cut off methodology there. I think it's just hidden behind the map. So I'm going to start this talk based on the information that was provided by Wild Species Canada in 2020. And the Wild Species Canada 2020 report actually came out in 2022. But the whole idea behind Wild Species Canada is it takes a snapshot of all the plants, animals, fungi, and slime molds in Canada and says how they're doing relatively across Canada. So if something is secure in British Columbia, it's secure in Canada. And if something's exotic in one part of the country, but not in somewhere else, it doesn't count. But from that report, about 6% of all of Canada's species are considered to be exotic, and that would be exotic across the country. And most of those are plants. Interestingly, there was only one lichen that is considered to be exotic in Canada, and I use that shot here. It's a species that we don't have in Yukon or Northwest Territories, but there is apparently one lichen that's exotic in Canada. So here's the Wild Species Canada website, and I don't know if you can see my cursor. I expect you can. I often use this search tool, and so I can look at the status of species across Canada. And so if I'm wondering about a particular plant, animal, or fungi, I can just type in either its common name or its scientific name, and it'll give me its status across the country. Wild Species Canada uses the conservation data center's data and wraps it all up and presents it every 5 years. And as I was doing this work, I also heard from Suzanne Carrière, who many of you probably know, who has now retired, but she put me on to the NWT species search. And this wasn't working yesterday, but I think there was a bug in the Northwest Territories government system yesterday. But I found this to be an excellent source of information. And again, I can use a scientific name or a common name and find out all sorts of information about Northwest Territories species. So on to the talk. According to the Wild Species Canada 2020 report, there were 226 exotic species in the Northwest Territories. And more than half of those, almost 2/3 of them, were vascular plants. And the other big groups are true bugs and beetles. And so when I was asked by the General Status of Canada, the Wild Species Canada, to do a review of the ranks for the Northwest Territories. And so I thought I would start with the exotic species, particularly because there's been two really good, quite comprehensive reports that were done by Mike Oldham. One was in 2007, and the other one was done in 2016, where he traveled throughout Western NWT and looked at all the exotic species and put out some great reports. So we had some really good new information, and he comments on all the species that he was anticipating to find. So when I reviewed these, I determined that 80 species are indeed exotic and regularly occurring in the Northwest Territories. And so that's only about half of them. The other half was I suggested they be removed. So most of the ones that I suggested to be removed were things that were accidental. And I will talk about that. Things that were just picked up once or twice and have never become established in the wild. So they really shouldn't be a species that you would expect to find if you were doing an inventory. Then there's ephemeral things, and again, I'll cover some of these. These are things that you would find growing in a disturbed area or a seeded area, and then you wait the winter, and then you go back to that site, and the plant will probably be gone because they aren't hardy enough to overwinter in the Northwest Territories yet. And then there was a bunch that were falsely reported where there is no evidence that they ever occurred in the Northwest Territories. So I'll cover those. And then I'm going to spend a bunch of time talking about the species that for 70 years or more have been considered to be exotic in the Northwest Territories, but I think there's strong evidence that they're actually native species. So I'm going to spend a bunch of time with those. And there was one species that I couldn't determine, and I've rethought about it for this presentation. So there was one that I had as unknown. So if you want to know what species are exotic in the Northwest Territories and are you would expect to see by going out, so I can say, go to Hayward River and look around, you're going to find this. There was this great new guide for the Northwest Territories. It's a checklist, so it's got all the species that are expected to be regularly occurring in the Northwest Territories. And on top of that, it's got a profile of 25 of the most common ones. So if you want to learn about the white sweet clover as it's on the cover, this is a great site. So if you haven't seen this before, this is wonderful. So and this aligns perfectly with the work that I reviewed. So I'm in full agreement with the whole report. So going through the species, uh, 24 species I thought should be removed because they were accidental. So many of these things have been reported possibly only once, and sometimes no more than 2 or 3 times, but there have been no recent reports, and many of those historical reports are really old. One of the interesting stories, because each of these I have a story about, but this one down at the bottom, the ball mustard, was also reported in Yukon, and I've been looking for this thing forever. It looks very similar to a native species that we have, and but I've never found it anywhere in the north, not in Alaska, Yukon, Northwest Territories, or anywhere in the north. And so I went in and tried to find out, where did this report come from? It turned out that a researcher, Bill Cody, who wrote the Plants of the Continental Northwest Territories, part of his job was for Agriculture Canada, was to walk cultivated fields and look for weeds. And so back in the 50s, he had found this plant. He had only found one. It was growing in a cultivated field, and he picked it. And he says, I collected this plant, is the only one. And it hasn't been reported since the 1950s. So I don't expect to be able to find this one. So I would consider this to be an accidental. It was confirmed, it was growing in a field, but it isn't regularly occurring in the Northwest Territories. Many of these other ones were found associated with gardens, so found just outside of a flower bed or something like this. But the two-row stone crop, it's never been found to become established in the wild in the Northwest Territories. So then a smaller group of ones, and ones that these ones are kind of hard to call, but they are the ephemeral ones. So these are the things that you frequently find on roadsides, but they don't actually overwinter. So if I go and look for this rapeseed at this kilometer post along the highway, and I go back there next year, it's probably gone. But many of these things are common contaminants of seed mixes, and so they get spread. They come in bird seed, they come in wildflower mixes, they come in agricultural seeds. So they're commonly picked up. Some of them, such as the rye, is even seeded along highways to try and keep other exotic species from becoming established, because we know that the rye doesn't persist. So in the cases of planting rye, it may occur in the same area for a couple of years based on that seed, but as soon as that seed is exhausted, it'll disappear. So there's a number of species that I recommended they remove as ephemerals. And the last group I recommended to be removed were things where there weren't any collections. Um, so spinach, I know that spinach can overwinter in my garden. If I let the plants go to seed, they will come back. Over time, they'll disappear, but there's no evidence that spinach has grown outside of that kind of a situation. So nowhere in the bush do you run into spinach. The three stamen waterwort, that was reported, but it's based on a misidentification of a similar aquatic species. And so the earlier report has been revised to a native species. Name's rocket is a real nasty exotic species. It looks a lot like fireweed. And so it's one of those ones I'm always on the lookout for. The only apparent record from the Northwest Territories was one that was cultivated, and it was growing in a yard and somebody made a collection of it, but it has never been known outside of cultivation. The tall buttercup is again a real problematic invasive plant. It's really common in Alberta, and it makes it very close to the Northwest Territories border and the Yukon border for that matter. When you go to Banff, which has a very similar climate and very similar flora associations, it's all over the place. But at the moment, it hasn't been found in the Yukon or in Northwest Territories. The one that really surprises me is the curled dock, because that is a real weedy plant of roadsides that I would expect to be found in Northwest Territories. It's an ephemeral in Yukon. It shows up, but it doesn't seem to persist. It'll be in the same area for a couple of years, but then dies out. Um, but all the records I could find of the curled dock in the Northwest Territory seem to be based on misidentifications. So it wouldn't surprise me that it's an exotic species, but I've yet to be able to find a confirmed collection of that one. So then on to the native species, and these are the ones that I think are the most interesting. So the first one is one that you often hear called white man's footprint. And this is a plant that you find all over the world. And it's a really important plant because you use it medicinally. So for instance, this is a plant that I use. If I get stung by a wasp, I just chew up the leaf and hold it on it, and it makes a really good poultice. So it draws things out. So if you ever get stung by a wasp, try using this. It's a great plant, and it's been used medicinally across the world. So sometimes it's traveled by accident. Often it's been planted because of its medicinal properties. But there was a study that happened in 2020, and I was involved with this, and the lead author contacted people around the world, and over 100 countries, I think it's 112 countries, contributed plants. And what she was trying to do was trying to track down where the plants were native and where the exotic plants moved from. And during that study, she discovered that there were at least 4 areas where there were native origins. So one of them was in Scandinavia and Western Europe, so the European clade. There was another group that was around Iran and Syria that they called the Mediterranean clade. And then there were ones in Southeast Asia. Um, the Southeast Asian ones, which are China and Japan and Korea, didn't seem to move around much. They didn't seem to be found all over the world. The other two were widespread. So most of the ones in North America originated from the European Scandinavian stock, but they did discover that there's a bunch that in California and places like that that originated from the Mediterranean. But interestingly, in the Yukon and Alaska, they found that the plants were distinctive, that they were not genetically linked to any of the other ones around the world. So we have a unique Beringian strain of this plant. And it seemed to make sense because when I first came to Yukon, I'd go to places where there weren't any other exotic plants, and I would find this plant in abundance. And so I was always suspicious. And I know that Eric Haltain, who worked on the plants of Alaska and the neighboring territories, had also remarked that he thought that this was a native species. But we probably also have the exotic species, which has more flat, more leathery leaves, whereas the native one is more erect and the leaves are kind of hairy. Interestingly, the first collection in Yukon was made in 1868 by William Dahl. And so this is the fellow that Dahl sheep are named after. And he talks about collecting it on the lower Yukon River in June of 1898. And he had a drawing from one of the communities he visited at that time. And so it may have been somewhere like this that he had collected it. It probably was in Alaska, but it was interesting. That was the first collection that's been attributed to Yukon. So another plant that had been reported for decades as being exotic in the Northwest Territories was the narrowleaf Colomia. And it's the reason people said that it was exotic is they said, well, it's only found in places near communities that have been disturbed, so it must be introduced. But this is a plant that likes disturbance, and it will thrive along roadsides and in communities. But if you look at the map below, and I don't know how easy it is to see this, and I'm horribly colorblind, so I'm not very good at describing what colors are. But you can see that for the southern US and Alaska, they have it as unranked. So it's considered to be native, but they just don't rank it. Throughout Canada, it is native and it's apparently secure or secure in all jurisdictions, but it was shown as being exotic in the Northwest Territories and also in the Atlantic provinces. And so I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. You'll often see the Quebec reports a lot of the things as exotic. And I think that they're probably things that are moving with climate change and aren't really exotic. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the evidence that I gathered was that this was a plant that was picked up on Great Slave Lake by Sir John Franklin and Dr. Richardson back in the 1820s. So it's pretty unlikely that it was an exotic plant at that time. And and considering all the surrounding jurisdictions consider it to be a native species, it's probably a native species that's weedy that grows in disturbance and makes it into the NWT. The exact same story is for this one, the pale smartweed. Again, they picked it up on the shores of Great Slave Lake, and most jurisdictions consider this one to be native. But interestingly, if you look down at the map, Pennsylvania considers it exotic. exotic. It's the only place in North America that considers it exotic at the moment. And also Virginia considers it. Oh, no, that's not Virginia. That's South Carolina, I guess it is, considers it to be a species at risk and vulnerable in their jurisdiction. Many of the ones that were considered to be exotic were are very weedy, and this is a classic example. The Canada horseweed. It's uh, called Erigeron canadensis. It's also known by another common Latin name. And when I travel in Europe, this is a species that's been introduced to Europe, and it's a weed that you find all throughout Germany and Holland and Sweden. It's a common exotic invasive uh, weed that gets spread around all throughout Europe. But in North America, it is where it originated. And again, you can see all the provinces and states have considered it to be native. It doesn't occur in Yukon. We've never actually found it in Yukon. There's a good reason to consider it to be exotic in Alaska. The only place that it regularly occurs is in a parking lot at the Fairbanks Airport. And that's the only place I've ever seen it in Alaska. I think it might also be in the Panhandle, but I'm not sure about that. But it's one of these ones that just makes it into the southern Northwest Territories around Hay River. And it's a weedy thing. So it's showing here that it's imperiled. Well, it's imperiled only because it's only been known from a couple of collections in the Hay River area. So it's not a species of conservation concern, but it's something that I would expect in the future should become much more widespread in the Northwest Territories. Again, Quebec is and the Atlantic provinces, Newfoundland, consider it to be exotic. And that I do entire presentations about species moving around, and the Yukon Northwest Territories are really at the forefront where a lot of species are moving. This isn't new. I mean, species have been moving back and forth into the Yukon and Northwest Territories for millions of years. And but with climate change, we're seeing a lot of things shifting. And when I think of animals, uh, they, for especially mammals, most people say these are just range expansions. So the mule deer arrived in Yukon in about the 1960s, and it's become established in south central Yukon. The coyote is came up about the 1920s. It's made it all the way up into the Richardson Mountains. We've had photographs of it up in the Richardson Mountains, but it's a pretty common species now in the southern Yukon, and the cougars have been following the deer, and they aren't quite as well established as the deer or the coyotes in Yukon. But in fact, in Yukon, we say we have somewhere between 0 and 300 cougars, but they're one of these species that we see occasionally. So these are things that have expanded their range as the habitat becomes more suitable for them. And I think a lot of our plants, our native plants, are doing the same thing. And this is a species that when I went to Tuktoyaktuk, I I did a big botanical inventory. I wandered every street. I looked around, and the only thing that I could find that was considered at that time to be introduced was one of the knotweeds. It was the um, Polygonum aviculare. And I thought, how is it possible that this thing is exotic when there's nothing else exotic around? It's probably moved by birds, and so I've been looking at its distribution. And interestingly, it is native to North America, and it's considered to be exotic in Washington and Quebec, and also in New Hampshire, but it's no longer considered to be exotic in the Northwest Territories. And one thing that's quite interesting is weedy things tend to, most jurisdictions consider them to be secure because they have, if they occur in disturbed areas and you can't really find reasons for their decline, they're often considered to be secure. But in uh, at least for Polygonum anchorinum, they're considered to be vulnerable in Alberta and Wyoming and British Columbia, but they seem to be doing just fine in the north, and they seem to be expanding their ranges. So these are plants that I commonly see on, gravel airstrips, on sides of gravel roads. They seem to be expanding their range in Yukon and Northwest Territories. I don't think they've actually made it up into the Arctic Islands yet, at least not in Northwest Territories. I don't recall seeing them there, but they are spread by birds, especially the birds that are moving in the springtime, like the snow buntings and the pipits and things like that. They'll often eat the old seeds and move them along, and so you'll find these in very remote areas. One that I've been battling with botanists across North America was this wormseed wallflower. And again, it's one of these things that likes disturbance. It grows in disturbed areas. It often occurs in really low numbers, except where you get a disturbance, and you will not notice it for a number of years, and then there'll be a slump, and suddenly it'll show up because it's in the seed bank. So it's not an ephemeral thing, but it it often is associated with disturbance. But interestingly, Grant Zazula and others, while they were doing work on ground squirrel middens. So ground squirrels during the last interglacial were going and collecting plants and bringing them down and storing them underground. And Grant did his master's on this, looking at what the plants, looking at old, not fossilized but mummified squirrel middens, and taking them apart and seeing what the plants were. And this is one of the plants that was in Yukon at least 30,000 years ago. And so I'm quite sure it's also in a native species and is expanding its range and likes disturbance. And I've convinced the folks in Ontario, and they've looked into it and they agree, but I still have some work to do in the rest of Canada, who can still consider it an exotic species. But it's circumpolar as well, so it's found all the way around the world. So that's where, because it also occurs in Europe and Russia, there is some claims, but it's hard to know unless you do a study like they did with the plantains to know the origin of this species. And this is my last one, and that's the unknown one. So this is a big, tall mustard. It's usually a biennial or a short-lived perennial. So it grow, grows from a seed. It'll form a rosette, and then it'll go up and flower and either die or live for a couple of years before dying. It likes growing in weedy areas. In Yukon, it was uh, uh, when the Flora of Yukon came out in 1996, the only collection that was known was from a roadside in Johnson's Crossing. And so it was considered to be introduced at that site. But I found it at Hot Springs in southeast Yukon, and again, long way from any um, source of contamination, no other introduced species, and a lot of things that were quite disjunct, like poison ivy and pearly everlasting and things like that. And so I believe that the ones in southeast Yukon are native. And I went to look at where they were found in Northwest Territories, and again, they were found along roadsides in the Yellowknife area and a few other areas in Southwest NWT. But they haven't been reported since around the 50s. So I expect this is a native species, but it probably is not regularly occurring in the Northwest Territories. But it looks like a lot of other mustard, so it's another one of these things that could have been and may still be being overlooked. So it's one to look out for. But considering the distribution, that it's native in all the places to the south, I expect this is another one of these species just expanding its range. So that's the end of my presentation. I took this photo in Fort Liard, and I thought it was really telling because I felt we were at a crossroads because the uh, carigana, which is an exotic invasive um, plant that is planted in hedgerows and places like that. And people in Fort Simpson will know it really well because whenever it's warm in July, the whole town, you can hear the popping of the carigana. And in uh, Fort Liard, it's replacing the willows along the Liard River. And so we're at a crossroads. And so I always liked this one. I thought it would be appropriate for this talk. So I am now open to questions, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that presentation, Bruce. Very fitting last slide. And thank you so much for plugging the field guide. I was planning on doing that, but you beat me to it. Yeah,
I don't
to
know
let
if I
folks.
can, sorry, I don't know if I can unshare. It's not, maybe you can do that.
I am not sure.
Because it's not, click on anyways. So you might just have to.
We can just look at your question slide. It's fine.
There you go. That's right. Yeah.
um, yeah,
So,
I had meant to mention the field guide. This is brand new as of this year, Field Guide to Alien Plants in the Northwest Territories, put together by the NWT Council on Invasive Species, Pests, and Pathogens. What you didn't mention, Bruce, is how much you helped us with this guide. So Bruce reviewed the species list and helped us with a lot of these tricky species, as we've just seen in this webinar. So thank you so much, Bruce, for all of your help. And for anyone who's looking for a copy of this guide, it is available online at our website. That's nwtkisp.ca, nwtcispp.ca. It's online there on our resources page. But if you would like a free hard copy, you can also send me an email at admin@nwtkisp.ca, and we'll send you a field guide. But with that, we are ready to take any questions, so folks can put their questions into the Q&A box or the chat. I'm not seeing any yet. That last species that you mentioned, the tower mustard, is a new one for me. I hadn't heard of that, and tried to look it up on the NWT species info base, but you are right, it appears to be down. So I'll talk to our comms folks about that and try to get that back up and running. Yeah, interesting. There's always new questions to be addressed, isn't there,
and
around
I
the origins
I
of species.
I heard on CBC yesterday that there was something wrong with the government of Northwest Territories website, and so I'm assuming that this is just a glitch and it'll
Hmm.
soon come back up. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, I had a question. Oh, or well, more of a comment, I guess, but just really interesting. You mentioned that study looking at ground squirrel middens and some of these other um, like paleo-ecological kind of techniques that can be used to try to get at the origin of some of these species, whether they are native or non-native in these areas. Um, as well as these methods around genetics and comparing the genes of plants that are collected in different parts of the world. Um, I guess if I could just ask a question, like what do you think is kind of the next, I don't know, another question that you think deserves attention around plants and their origins and might be looked at in the future moving forward.
Well, we've certainly the world has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. So in 2010, I met the barcoding folks out at Churchill, and that's the first time I'd ever heard of barcoding. And plants don't work very well, don't work as well as animals when we're looking at their genetic barcodes. Um, but when we're I think what should be reviewed is looking just like I did at all the um, plants that were considered to be exotic, is reviewing all the other species that are considered exotic. There was a caterpillar that was considered to be a threat to a willow in Quebec because it was considered to be exotic. And then they've looked at it genetically and they've discovered that there are a number of strains that only occur in North America. So it's again one of these ones that's found around the world, but it becomes really common at certain times. It's eruptive, and you go to a Nuvik and every willow is covered with this tussock moth, and then they'll disappear, and you'll only see them a couple of times a year. So that's another. We're learning a lot about um, the invertebrates that are.
Mm,
So that's something that's changing. But yeah, this whole barcoding and looking at their genetics is a new science, and I'm really excited to hear what will happen in the next 10 years, what kind of advancements will made. We might be able to have a tricorder and just beep, 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 and see
nice.
what they show up. Interestingly, though, um, you were talking about baby. Grant Zazula was my first student who came and stayed in my herbarium and collected macrofossils. So what he was looking for were plant fragments because you couldn't use DNA back then. And so what he was looking for was seeds, and then he'd compare what he was finding in the middens with, the seeds or the leaves or the stems of various plants and trying to identify them that way. And now you just put the nest in a blender and it'll tell you what all the plants are in there. So it's amazing how much we've come in just a few years.
Mm-hmm. For sure, a really promising field for research. All
Well, I'd like
right.
it doesn't look like we've got a lot of questions, but if anybody does have any questions, you can see my email. Feel free to send me an email, and I'd be happy to answer any questions people have. And
Perfect.
keep using iNaturalist. That's the best way to provide data. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know, is that how you are getting data in? That's
Yep.
what we tell everybody in Yukon. If you
Yep.
want to report an exotic species that you're worried about or you're trying to figure out the identification, put it up on iNaturalist. I know that sometimes during the summer, if I'm in the field, I get behind, but I know I'm totally up to date on all the observations in the Northwest Territories,
Yep.
Yukon, and NWT or
Yeah.
Nunavut right now. So,
Yeah. No,
um,
you're
and
very reliable.
and
I'll
there's a
say,
lot of other folks who are out there looking as well. So,
yeah.
um, thank you all for joining us, and thank you for inviting me.
Of course, yeah. Thank you so much, Bruce. Thank you for also plugging iNaturalist. That is my favorite. That's my go-to as well. I put all of my plant pictures up there, and it's always you who identifies them for me. So thank you for that as well.
And
Um,
Josine. Josine is doing an awful lot, so she's great.
yeah, yeah, no, it's a great community, so I encourage everyone to use iNaturalist. But yeah, with that, I'll just say thank you again, Bruce, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar. We have one more webinar left tomorrow, so if you are interested in joining that webinar on aquatic invasive species, you can find more information on our website or on our Facebook page. Just look us up at NWT Council on Invasive Species, Pests, and Pathogens. But thank you so much, and take care, everyone.